began with a silence so complete and so violently unnatural that it felt less like sound stopping and more like reality itself forgetting the concept of sound. And I remember it with a clarity that still refuses to fade, because I was standing within the lower reliquary corridors beneath the Imperial Palace of Terra, where the air is always thick with incense, static prayers, and the distant psychic pressure of the Astronomican pressing through every bone in the body, like an eternal reminder that something vast and godlike is still technically alive above us. And in that moment, without warning, without transition, without any mercy, the pressure vanished, not diminished or weakened, but cut cleanly away, as if an unseen hand had severed the thread connecting humanity to its only guiding star, and every astropath within range collapsed at once, screaming not in pain but in confusion, because their minds had been trained since birth to interpret that pressure as the background shape of existence itself. And when it disappeared, the brain had nothing left to hold on to, and I saw one of them claw at his own eyes as if trying to pull meaning back into his skull, while the corridor's lumen strips flickered into a dim, uncertain glow that made everything look diseased. And for 7 seconds, though at the time I thought it was 7 hours, no one spoke, no one breathed properly, and even the servitors halted mid-task as if awaiting a command that would never arrive. And then the alarms tried to activate, but failed in a way that should have been impossible, their holy machine spirits choking mid-cant, producing only fractured tones like broken hymns. And I remember thinking absurdly that even the Imperium's machines were afraid, and that thought terrified me more than the silence itself, because fear implies awareness, and awareness implies understanding, and nothing in the Imperium is supposed to understand what happens when the God Emperor stops speaking through the warp. And that was when I felt it, not heard, not seen, but felt like a pressure change behind the eyes. The realization that the Golden Throne was no longer broadcasting anything. No psychic hum, no controlled agony, no divine signal filtered through 10,000 daily sacrifices. Nothing. And I had been trained my entire life to believe that the Emperor of mankind upon the Golden Throne was not merely a ruler, but a stabilizing mechanism for reality itself. A psychic engine sustaining the Imperium's fragile connection to the warp. And when that mechanism stops, even briefly, reality does not wait politely to see what happens next. And I saw the first custodian move at that moment, not in panic, never panic, but in a shift of posture so subtle it felt like the universe tightening its grip, his golden armor reflecting the dim corridor lights like a dying sun. And behind him the sealed gates to the Sanctum Imperialis remained closed, unmoving. Yet, somehow they felt less like a barrier and more like a warning that something inside had changed shape. And I realized then that no one had actually confirmed what silence from the throne meant, because it had never been silent in recorded history, not once since the Emperor had been bound to it after the final days of unification. And even the oldest texts describe it as an endless psychic scream so vast it becomes background reality. So when that scream stopped, it did not feel like relief, it felt like abandonment. And somewhere, deep inside the palace structure, I swear I heard something that sounded like breath being drawn for the first time in 10,000 years. But it was not human breath, and it was not mechanical either. And I still do not know if it was real, or if my mind was already beginning to fracture under the absence of the Astronomican, because without it the warp feels closer, not farther, as if all of humanity's collective nightmares had been leaning against a thin wall that had suddenly disappeared. And I remember running, though I do not remember deciding to run, toward the observation lumen arrays where the Astronomican's projection should have been visible, even through sealed corridors. And instead there was only darkness, not physical darkness, but conceptual absence, like a part of the universe had been erased from meaning itself. And along the way I saw adepts kneeling in prayer not because they were devout, but because their minds needed something to repeat, or they would dissolve into panic. And I heard one whisper the same phrase over and over, "He is still there, he is still there," but their voice cracked by the 10th repetition, because repetition is what humans do when truth becomes unbearable. And when I reached the central relay chamber, the great hexagonal vault where the signal from the throne is normally interpreted into navigational certainty for the entire Imperium, I saw the adepts inside staring at empty data streams that should have been burning with psychic fire. And one of them turned to me with eyes so hollow I knew before they spoke that whatever they had seen had already rewritten them, and they said only this: "There is no signal." And in that moment I understood something no sanctioned text ever prepares you for: that the Emperor is not simply a figure upon the Emperor of mankind, but the reason the galaxy itself can be navigated, the reason hope has direction, and without him even time begins to lose confidence in itself. And then the screaming started. It did not begin as a unified sound, but as a fracture in the idea of silence itself. Because at first what we heard was not screaming in the way a human mind expects it, but 1,000 different failures of reality, overlapping at once, like distant thunder heard through water. And I remember gripping the edge of the relay console so tightly that the metal beneath my fingers began to warm, as if it too was reacting to something that should not have been audible in the physical realm, and the adepts around me did not immediately understand that what they were hearing was not coming from the room, but from everywhere. Because the silence of the Astronomican had not simply removed a guiding signal, it had torn away the pressure barrier that kept the warp from bleeding freely into human perception. And in that absence, the first thing to seep through was pain. Not individual pain, not personal suffering, but the aggregated psychic echo of every living mind in the Imperium, suddenly realizing, even unconsciously, that the guiding light of humanity had blinked out. And I saw one of the relay scribes begin to laugh, uncontrollably while crying at the same time, his hands still dutifully recording nothing on parchment out of pure muscle memory. And that was when I realized that sanity was not a stable condition here, but a negotiation between the mind and the Astronomican's constant influence. And without it, that negotiation collapsed instantly, because the Astronomican had never been just a beacon for navigation, but a psychic stabilizer filtering the raw terror of the warp into something survivable for unaugmented minds. And now that filter was gone, and the warp responded like a lung finally allowed to inhale after being strangled for 10,000 years, and the result was not peace but expansion, violent and immediate, and the screaming intensified into structured patterns. Because what I began to understand was that each distinct wave of sound corresponded to different psychic catastrophes propagating across the Imperium at once. Entire fleets lost in translation between real space and the immaterium. Astropath choirs collapsing mid-communication as their minds encountered infinite static where the Emperor's presence should have been. And worse still, the sudden realization among billions of untrained psychers that the invisible restraint on their abilities had vanished, causing spontaneous and uncontrolled psychic discharge events that burned entire hab blocks into glass-smooth silence. And yet none of this was visible to us in the traditional sense, because the Imperial Palace on Terra remained physically intact, its massive Gothic architecture still towering above like a monument to eternal authority. But its meaning had changed in an instant, and I saw a custodian enter the corridor then, one of the Emperor's golden warriors of the Adeptus Custodes, and for the first time in my life I saw uncertainty in one of them, not in his stance or discipline, but in the way he paused at the threshold as if recalculating the laws of reality before stepping forward, because even they, forged for absolute obedience and clarity, had never been trained for a universe without the constant psychic anchor of the Emperor's presence. And behind him came the low rhythmic movement of other custodians assembling, not rushing, never rushing, but converging like a mathematical inevitability. And I realized that their presence was not reassurance, but containment, because when gods fall silent, even their guardians become janitors of collapse. And somewhere deeper in the palace structure I felt a second wave of absence, stronger than the first, like something trying to assert that the initial silence had been incomplete. And this time I understood what it was. The Astronomican itself was not merely gone from perception, it was flickering, unstable, as if something within its source was either struggling or being obstructed. And that thought should have been impossible, because the Astronomican is not supposed to struggle. It is supposed to burn eternally through sacrifice and will, maintained by the endless psychic martyrdom of thousands within the hollow mountain. Yet now even that explanation felt like superstition rather than certainty. and I remember moving through the corridor toward the central interpretation chamber where the Imperial data vaults attempted to translate warp phenomena into navigational coordinates, and every step felt heavier, not physically but existentially, as if the concept of direction itself was weakening. And when I arrived, I saw the adepts gathered around a blank hololith that should have displayed the Emperor's guiding light, and instead it showed only interference patterns that looked disturbingly like neural activity, like something thinking through the machine. And one of the senior adepts whispered that the machine spirits were no longer responding to command cant, but were instead repeating corrupted fragments of old astropathic transmissions, and I did not want to believe what that implied, because it suggested that even the machines designed to interpret divine signals were now drowning in raw warp echo. And then the second phase of screaming began, and this time it was personal, because the sound no longer felt distant or cosmic but intimate, as if every individual mind across the Imperium had suddenly become aware of its own isolation. And I saw visions without seeing them, flashes of void ships drifting off course into impossible geometries, their Geller fields collapsing like broken prayers, entire planetary defense systems firing blindly at nothing because their command vox had filled with screaming instead of orders. And I understood then that the Imperium was not experiencing chaos as an external invasion, but as a systemic failure of meaning, because the Emperor upon the Golden Throne had not just been a ruler, but a filter through which reality was made interpretable. And now interpretation itself was dissolving, and I remember asking aloud, though I do not remember forming the question fully, "How long has it been silent?" And no one answered because time had already begun to behave inconsistently, with some claiming seconds and others insisting on hours. And that inconsistency was more terrifying than the silence itself, because it meant causality was slipping. And then one of the custodians finally spoke, his voice calm in the way only something catastrophic can be calm. And he said only that the throne chamber doors had not opened, had not signaled, and had not responded to internal checks for what they believed was 7 minutes, though none of them trusted that number anymore. And in that moment, I understood the true horror was not that the Emperor had fallen silent, but that no one knew what silence meant for him, whether it was death, rest, withdrawal, or something far worse. Attention turned inward, away from humanity entirely, and as that realization settled, the screaming outside the palace shifted again, becoming less like pain and more like recognition, as if something vast in the warp had noticed that the center of humanity's gravity had moved or vanished, and was now deciding whether to step closer. What came after was not escalation in any normal sense, but collapse layered upon collapse until the mind could no longer distinguish between events and interpretations of events. And I remember because the corridor lights dimmed again, though no one issued a command for it, and every lumen strip began to pulse in irregular rhythms that matched nothing human, nothing mechanical, and certainly nothing sanctioned by the machine cult. And I could feel the entire Imperial Palace behaving like a body suddenly losing circulation, not dying outright, but redistributing whatever remained of its function toward survival without understanding what it was surviving. And the custodians shifted positions in a pattern I later realized was not defensive but diagnostic, as if their presence alone could map where reality was breaking. And I saw one of them place a gauntleted hand against the wall, remaining still for several seconds. And when he removed it, there was a faint scorch mark in the shape of a symbol I did not recognize but instinctively feared, because it looked less like writing and more like an intrusion. And that was when the third wave of screaming began. And this time, it was no longer spread across distance or filtered through perception, but felt as if it originated inside the listening itself, as if the act of hearing had become the source of suffering. And I dropped to my knees without realizing I had lost balance because gravity itself felt uneven, like the planet was remembering a different orientation, and the adepts around me began to recite litany after litany, but the words failed to maintain structure, syllables breaking apart mid-prayer like decomposing data. And I understood then that language depends on stability just as much as faith does, and both were failing simultaneously. And somewhere deep beneath the palace, the machinery that maintained the Golden Throne's life support systems continued operating. I am certain of that. because there was still a faint mechanical tremor beneath everything. But it felt wrong, like a heartbeat that had forgotten what body it belonged to. And I remember thinking of the Emperor of mankind not as a god or ruler, but as a fixed point in reality that everything else was built around. And if that point shifted even slightly, then the entire structure of existence would begin to rotate into new, incompatible geometry. And I saw one of the data priests begin to scream not in fear, but in revelation. His eyes locked on the blank hololith as if he could finally see something others could not. And before anyone could restrain him, he clawed at his own skull and collapsed, whispering that the stars were no longer aligned. Though he did not mean astronomy, he meant meaning itself. And then the custodians moved, not toward us, but away from us, deeper into the inner sanctum access corridors, because something had changed in their priority hierarchy, something that even their implanted obedience could not ignore. And I realized with a cold certainty that the silence from the Golden Throne was not being treated as a failure anymore, but as an active condition requiring containment. And that distinction terrified me more than anything else because it implied intent somewhere within the absence. And I began to run again through corridors that now felt longer than they should have been, each junction slightly misaligned with memory, as if the palace layout was being rewritten by someone who had never been inside it before, but understood its function too well. And I passed servitor convoys that were no longer moving in coordinated paths, but instead circling endlessly around fixed points like insects, trapped in invisible gravity wells. And I saw a group of scribes kneeling around a torn page of scripture, as if it had become the only stable object in their reality. And when I reached the central observation conduit, I finally saw something I was never meant to see directly, not because it was forbidden, but because it should have been impossible. The space where the Astronomican's psychic beam should have been visible through layered instrumentation was not merely dark, it was inverted, as if light itself had been folded inward rather than emitted outward. And within that inversion I felt a presence that was not the Emperor, but the absence of him shaped into structure. And every instinct I had screamed to look away, but I could not, because even fear had begun to lose its boundaries, and the screaming across the Imperium shifted again into something almost intelligible, almost like words forming at the edge of comprehension. And I swear I heard a phrase repeated across billions of broken minds at once. Not a prayer, not a curse, but a question. Where is he? And the tragedy was not that it was asked, but that it had no direction to be answered toward, because without the guiding light of the Emperor upon the Golden Throne, there was no longer a center to existence in human terms. And as that realization settled fully into the bones of the Imperial Palace, the custodians stopped moving entirely for the first time since the silence began, and every lumen in the corridor stabilized into a single cold white tone. And in that stillness I understood the 7th minute had not ended, it had only learned how to continue. The stillness that followed was not peace, but a deeper violation, because silence had now become organized, structured, almost intelligent in the way it pressed itself against every surface of thought. And I remember realizing that the screaming had not stopped at all. It had simply changed its form again, compressing itself beyond audible perception into something that vibrated through meaning rather than sound. And the custodians stood, perfectly still in a formation that looked ceremonial, only if one did not understand that ceremony in the Imperium is often indistinguishable from emergency protocol. And I could see the smallest details of their armor now with unbearable clarity, each gold plate reflecting not the corridor lights, but faint distortions that looked like distant faces, trying and failing to form. And I understood then that even their perfection was not immunity, only resistance, and that resistance was being tested in real time by something none of us had language for. And somewhere deep within the Imperial Palace, the systems governing the Golden Throne issued a pulse, faint, irregular, not the steady divine agony we were trained to interpret as normal function, but something closer to a hesitation, like a machine reconsidering its own operation. And that single irregularity caused every astropath still alive within range to collapse simultaneously, not from overload, but from recognition, because they felt it too. The Emperor was not absent in the simple sense of being gone. He was absent in a way that suggested awareness of absence, and that distinction shattered what remained of structured belief. And I remember one custodian finally turning his head toward the sealed sanctum doors, not as a soldier, awaiting command, but as something closer to a witness, waiting for judgment. And in that moment, I felt a pressure shift in the warp so profound, it was like an entire ocean reversing its current. And the screaming, if it could still be called that, condensed into a single overwhelming impression that struck every mind at once. Not pain, not fear, but attention, as if something vast beyond the veil had finally noticed that the center of humanity's psychic anchor had gone quiet and was now leaning closer to inspect the silence. And I found myself unable to breathe properly because even breathing felt like an intrusion into a system that no longer belonged to us. And the adepts around me began to whisper again, but the words were wrong, rearranged mid-sentence, as if their tongues were no longer fully obeying human grammar. And I saw one of them look at his own hands with horror, as though they were unfamiliar instruments. And I realized then that identity itself was destabilizing at the edges, because identity depends on continuity of perception, and perception depends on reference. And the emperor upon the emperor of mankind had been that reference for 10,000 years, whether anyone admitted it or not. And without him, even selfhood began to lose anchoring, and the custodians finally moved again. But this time, not outward or inward, rather upward through the hierarchy of command that no longer responded, as if they were ascending a ladder that had lost its top, and I followed at, compelled more by inevitability than courage. And the corridors leading toward the inner sanctum felt different now, less like architecture and more like memory attempting to correct itself, and the walls bore inscriptions that I swear were not there before, though I could not read them without feeling a sense of intrusion into my own thoughts. And at one junction, I saw a sealed maintenance hatch vibrating softly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it in slow, deliberate intervals. And every instinct told me not to look at it for too long, and I did not. But I heard something. Through it, that was almost a voice, not speaking words but shaping intention, and the meaning was simple and unbearable. Still here, and I do not know if it was reassurance or warning, because by that point language had begun to fail as a reliable carrier of intent, and then we reached the threshold before the final approach to the throne chamber, and even the custodians paused there, because the air itself felt heavier, saturated with psychic residue so dense it behaved like gravity. And I realized with a sinking certainty that whatever had occurred in those missing 7 minutes was not over, not completed, not concluded, but ongoing in a way we could no longer observe directly. And somewhere far beyond the physical walls of the palace, across the entire span of the Imperium, the screaming had unified again into a single waveform of meaning. And that meaning was not, "He is gone," but something far worse, something that made every soul instinctively recoil at once. "He is aware." And in that instant I understood the true terror was not silence, but response, because if the emperor upon the golden throne had become aware of the silence, then the silence itself had become part of him. What followed was not a continuation in the way human minds understand events, but a tightening of reality around a single unbearable implication, because once the idea took hold that the emperor upon the golden throne was not merely silent, but aware of that silence, everything else in existence began to reorganize itself around that thought like iron filings around a magnet. And I remember the corridor lights dimming again, not because power failed, but because illumination itself seemed to lose confidence, and the custodians finally broke formation in a way that was not disorder, but priority inversion, as if some internal command deeper than loyalty had overridden their stillness, and they moved toward the inner sanctum doors with a speed that still did not feel like haste, but like inevitability accelerating. And I followed because there was nothing left outside that made sense anymore, and the air grew heavier with each step until it felt like breathing through layers of unseen pressure that carried meaning rather than oxygen. And I began to notice that the architecture of the imperial palace was subtly wrong in ways that could not be attributed to damage or perception failure, because angles no longer aligned with memory and distances felt self-adjusting, as if the palace was attempting to maintain a coherent geometry under conditions it was not designed to support. And I saw inscriptions carved into the stone that I knew had been there for millennia, yet now seemed to rearrange themselves when not directly observed, forming patterns that resembled prayers but resolved into warnings when stared at too long. And somewhere far below us, the machinery of the Astronomican, that vast psychic beacon sustained by unimaginable sacrifice, emitted a pulse that was no longer steady, but hesitant, like a giant heart attempting to remember its own rhythm. And every astropath still capable of consciousness across the nearby sectors screamed in unison again, not in pain but in recognition, because what they felt was not absence anymore, but attention focused outward, as if the guiding light of humanity had turned its gaze back toward itself for the first time in 10,000 years. And I understood then that the true horror of silence was not that it meant nothing was there, but that something had been listening to the silence form, and now I could feel that listening becoming directional, converging, focusing, narrowing like a blade of thought passing through the warp. And the custodians reached the threshold of the inner sanctum and stopped. Not because they were forbidden, but because the doors themselves had changed. The immense sealed gates that normally represent the absolute boundary between mortal existence and the throne's reality now appeared less like barriers and more like membranes, subtly breathing, subtly responsive. And I saw one of the golden warriors place his hand against it and hold it there longer than any human would dare. And when he withdrew, there was a faint tremor in his stance that I had never seen in one of them before. Not fear, not doubt, but recalibration, as if something inside had updated its understanding of physics and found it insufficient. And then the doors began to open on their own, not with mechanical force, but with the reluctant compliance of matter itself. And what poured out was not light or sound, but presence. A psychic weight so immense that I dropped to my knees without conscious decision. And in that moment I felt the Emperor not as a figure or entity, but as a structure of will spanning impossible dimensions, fractured yet continuous, sustained upon agony and purpose and something like infinite refusal. And yet within that presence there was now something else layered upon it, something unfamiliar, a subtle discontinuity, like a second thought forming behind the first. And I realized with growing horror that the silence of those 7 minutes had not been empty, but occupied, not by absence but by transition, as if something had briefly interrupted the eternal mechanism of the Golden Throne, and in that interruption, a new condition had been tested against reality itself, and I saw flashes without seeing them properly. The throne room itself as a vast, impossible chamber of gold and decay, the Emperor of mankind bound upon it not as a corpse, nor as a living man, but as an axis around which suffering rotates. And for the first time in all recorded psychic history, that axis had deviated by a fraction, not breaking, not failing, but shifting awareness. And every psyker across the Imperium felt it simultaneously as a recoil in the warp, as if something vast had blinked, and in that blink noticed every soul that depended upon it. And the custodians entered first, their silhouettes swallowed by the threshold, and I followed because there was no remaining concept of safety to remain outside. And inside the chamber the air was not air, but pressure made sentient, and the Golden Throne dominated everything, not as a seat, but as a mechanism of impossible design, layered with archaic technology and psychic conduits and ancient sorcery indistinguishable from engineering at this scale. And upon it the Emperor was present in a way that defied stillness, because even in supposed immobility there was motion at the level of thought itself. And the screaming I had heard for 7 minutes across the Imperium suddenly resolved into its source, not from outside but from the interface between him and everything else. And I understood that what had stopped was not communication but filtering, and what had resumed was not communication but direct exposure. And the Emperor upon the Emperor of mankind was now perceiving without restraint the accumulated psychic reality of his own empire all at once, unmediated, and the effect of that perception was not anger or mercy but structural transformation. Because reality bends when something that large chooses to fully acknowledge what it sustains, and I felt the warp itself convulse as if a vast eye had opened within it and was now looking back through every available fracture, and the custodians knelt for the first time not in ceremony, but in response to pressure beyond command. And I understood then that the 7 minutes had not been silence in his experience, but something else entirely, something like interruption, something like contact, something like the Emperor briefly existing without the full load of humanity's constant psychic demand. And in that absence, something had occurred that no one in the Imperium was meant to survive the awareness of. And as I looked upon the throne, I realized the most horrifying possibility was not that he had gone silent, nor that he had screamed, but that he had listened, and in listening had changed the nature of what it meant to be heard, and the screaming across reality shifted one final time, no longer fragmented, no longer chaotic, but unified into a single coherent transmission that did not travel through space but through understanding itself, and it said only this without words: return. The moment that word, if it can still be called a word, passed through everything at once, the Imperial Palace ceased to feel like a place and became instead a single unified nervous system reacting to an external stimulus. And I remember because the custodians all moved at the exact same time, not as soldiers obeying command, but as living weapons responding to an existential correction in reality itself, and the air inside the throne chamber tightened again, as if the universe was inhaling and refusing to exhale, and the Emperor upon the golden throne remained seated, yet no longer felt stationary, because what I saw, what we all felt, was that his attention was now fully distributed across every fragment of the Imperium simultaneously, and the effect of that attention was not comfort or guidance, but exposure, as if every hidden corner of human suffering, every forgotten war, every dying prayer, every collapsing void ship, every psyker burning out in isolation had been brought into direct contact with him at the same instant, and the screaming that had once been chaos became pattern, and that pattern became structure, and that structure became unbearable coherence, and I realized then that what the 7 minutes had done was not silence the Emperor, but loosen the constraint that separated his awareness from his empire. And now that constraint was gone, or damaged, or reconfigured in ways no one could understand. And the result was not death, but total reciprocity between God and creation. And I saw the Astronomican flare in my mind's perception like a wound reopening, its light no longer distant or guiding, but immediate and invasive. And across the warp, every astropath who still lived became a conduit for something far larger than themselves, not receiving messages but being overwritten by presence. And I felt my own thoughts begin to fracture at the edges as I tried to interpret what I was witnessing, because interpretation itself was becoming unstable. And the custodians reached the inner platform surrounding the throne, and for the first time I saw them hesitate, not out of fear, but out of recognition that there was no protocol for what was happening. Because the Emperor was no longer merely sustaining the Imperium. He was actively perceiving it in its entirety, and that perception had weight, and that weight was changing the structure of the warp like a hand pressing into wet clay. And I remember thinking that the galaxy itself was being judged not in moral terms, but in informational terms, as if all existence was being evaluated for coherence under a consciousness too vast to ignore contradiction. And somewhere deep within that impossible moment, I understood the true nature of the 7-minute silence. It had been a lapse in mediation, a brief suspension of the buffer between divine cognition and human reality. And during that suspension, something had entered the gap, not an invader in the traditional sense, but an event, a possibility that should not have been allowed to form. And now the Emperor's awareness had encountered it directly, and I saw, felt, rather than understood, that the Golden Throne was compensating, adjusting, correcting, and every correction sent ripples through the Imperium like aftershocks of a collapsing star. And the custodians finally knelt fully at the base of the platform, not as worship, but as stabilization, anchoring themselves to reality through discipline, because everything else was becoming fluid. And I realized I could no longer trust my senses, because even the concept of seeing was being rewritten in real time. And the Emperor upon the Emperor of mankind turned his attention, if direction still applies, to the source of my perception. And in that instant I felt myself seen not as an individual, but as a collection of memories, Fears and neural patterns arranged temporarily into identity, and that identity was recognized, not judged, but acknowledged as part of the structure he was now fully conscious of. And the screaming across existence resolved into something quieter, but infinitely more terrifying, understanding without distance. And I knew then that the Imperium had never been ruled from above, but sustained from within, and that what we called faith had always been a necessary insulation layer between humanity and a truth too large to survive directly. And that insulation had just failed, and the throne room lights stabilized into a single absolute white that contained no shadow, no variation, no refuge. And in that light I saw the final implication forming not as prophecy, but as certainty. The Emperor had not awakened, had not fallen silent, had not screamed. He had expanded awareness, and nothing in the galaxy was designed to survive being fully known.